Well, good afternoon. Wonderful to see so many faces. This has been quite a week here for the council. We have had a number of great programs, including a reception last night, which went for some of us very, very late at the Museum of Contemporary Art. But tonight, this afternoon, I'm really, really pleased to have three representatives of two major countries and 27 major countries here with us today to have a conversation about what's happening in the world. I will just say off the bat, when you're a diplomat, you don't comment on the internal politics of other states. So you can ask, but you won't get an answer if you want to know who they believe should be the president of the United States. You all here, assuming you're U.S. citizens, get to make that decision. So with that, let me introduce the panel here today. To my immediate left is Dame Karen Pierce, the British ambassador to the United States. Previously served as the UK permanent representative to the UN and the Director General for Political Affairs at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Next, we have Jovita Neliupšienė, I think I got that, who is the EU ambassador to the United States. Previously, she served as Lithuania's Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs, Vice Minister of Economy and Innovation, and Chancellor and State Secretary of Lithuania's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And she just told me her next position, what she'd like to be is the head director of the school, the International Affairs, the School for Foreign Service,
yes.
Folks, because she could do what I do, which is read the newspaper in the morning. Because right now she doesn't have time to do that. Last, but certainly not least, Rosemary Banks is the New Zealand ambassador to the United States. She previously was ambassador to the United States from 2018 to 2022 and has just been reappointed in June of 2024 as, again, New Zealand's ambassador to the United States. She, before that, was the permanent representative to the United Nations and also to the OECD, and has had numerous other important posts. We will start off today with just a conversation among the three of us. We will then open it up to questions from the audience, which can be either live here in person, or if you're watching online, you can type in ccga.live and ask a question there. Just a reminder that today's program is on the record. Any views, of course, expressed by the speakers of those of the speakers and should not be taken as views of the council. So with that, let's get going. Just a question to all three of you, and Rosemary, let me start with you. As we are looking at the increased complexity of the world that we face today in 2024, what do you and your government see as some of the most significant opportunities and challenges that we face in the international community, and how could cooperation among New Zealand, the European Union, the UK, and the United States both deal with those challenges and perhaps address and exploit the opportunities?
Well, Ivo, first, thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to bring a Southern Hemisphere and Indo-Pacific perspective. In my foreign ministry, when we think about our future directions for foreign policy and trade policy, we're really thinking hard about what we see as three big global shifts. And the first of these is from rules to power, as we've seen most blatantly in Russia's move against Ukraine. The second one is from a focus on economics to focus on security, and that's an obvious response to a more dangerous, uncertain world. And the third one is from efficiency to resilience. That's kind of a pandemic message. But let me focus a bit on the first one, because I think the most urgent and dangerous of these, particularly for a smaller country like New Zealand, is that shift from rules to power. And in terms of, what can we do about it? How can we work together to respond to this change in our environment? Well, I'll take the example of Russia's move against Ukraine. And I'm not sure if you've heard of it so much, but the grouping called the Indo-Pacific Four, which is a group of countries, Australia, Japan, Republic of Korea, and New Zealand. And we formed after the beginning of the Ukraine war to be supportive of Ukraine, but to work with NATO and with the US to help do what we could. So there's an example of cooperation in response to one of those changes. But I think that last one of rules to power, especially for Karen and me having been together at the UN, you really wonder what is the future for the multilateral-based order. But let me leave it dangling there for the others to provide some answers.
Terrific. Thanks, Rosemary. Jovita.
Well, probably I should take from where the colleague just finished. I think that one of the biggest challenges we are facing actually is a challenge for our rule-based order, which we had after the Second World War. And up till now, probably we have all naively believed around the Atlantic that this is the order where everybody wants to live in. This is where we share all the same values, or at least people around the world would like to share those values. And it seems it's not the case anymore. And of course, the one of the most tragic examples is Russia's war in Ukraine. But if we look what is happening around the world, is really, for the last couple of years, or even the 5 years, is really definitely much more dangerous place. And when we think about, it's not only the challenge for our national security, but is as well the challenge for our economic security. Economic coercion is on the play. And it's not only one country using that tool. There are many more others. All the tools which we thought that it's kind of we over that, be it energy coercion, be it cyber attacks. I think that this is all comes out because in general the rules of world order are challenged. And when you think as what we can do about it, or what, as you phrased the question, what the corporation can do about it, I just don't think of any instance where we can reestablish or confirm that those rules are the ones we want to live with. We can do that alone. Any of our countries or jurisdictions, we cannot do that alone. And this is what Ukrainians are fighting. This is where we are supporting them, and we are fighting. And it does not really come for granted. And I think that's probably the most challenging for upcoming years.
Karen, how do you see it?
Well, I agree with what Rosemary and Jovita said. I think for the first quarter, almost the first quarter of this century, we had all these new global challenges like migration, like climate, like health, of which I think the biggest is technology and AI. And they were completely different from the challenges we'd had since 1945. And we needed different structures to get to grips with them. You have all these new kids on the block, like Saudi Arabia, like Mexico, wanting their share, quite rightly, of world governance, for want of a better phrase. And then you have the rise of non-state actors for good and ill. And we were grappling with all of that. And then, as Rosemary said, along comes the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we not only have the different world created by the 21st century, we have to go back to the power struggle that we were familiar with or read about since 1945. But I do take heart from the fact that on the Western developed world, it's difficult to get the terms right, so excuse me, this is very simplistic. We have alliances. We believe in cooperation. We believe in trying to find a way forward and giving space for everyone's voice. Most of the people who we work with as partners want their citizens to live in open societies. And I think through history, open societies have been shown to bring the most benefits to ordinary citizens rather than closed societies. And I think that's a message that we need to get out much more than we're having success in at the moment. And I think one of the challenges is that if you're a middle ground country, a closed society is a lot easier to run than an open society. We're very messy. We have this internet thing. It's completely open. We have AI. If you're a government of a small country, possibly a new government, that is quite a terrifying prospect. The public policy ramifications are very, very difficult. And I don't think we do enough to acknowledge that and help what I'm going to call the middle ground countries find a way forward. So personally, I think that's the challenge. It's about explaining why open societies, for all their complications, still bring the most benefits to ordinary citizens and to the general cause of world affairs.
A lot here to go into some detail. So, let me start, Rosemary, with what you mentioned, the fact that the four Asian Indo-Pacific powers, allies, partners of the United States in particular, decided that being more closely associated with the European and transatlantic powers to deal with the Russia structure was new and different. A recognition that the security challenges that you confront in one region have ramifications for another region. In that regard, another big security challenge to the rules of our power is important is China. Much more closely to where you are. Even though you're in the southern hemisphere, it turns out it's a very large ocean, that Pacific Ocean, but it's your neighbors in one form or another when you think about it. How would you like to see Europe and North America and the Indo-Pacific countries to cooperate better or more effectively when it comes to dealing with the challenge that China poses?
Okay, thank you. Well, look, first up, your point about the sort of indivisibility of the security environments. I mean, we feel in our Indo-Pacific region that we've kind of worked that out. It's very clear. Not so totally sure, and I'd be interested in Karen's and Jovita's views as to whether that is also so well understood from the northern perspective. But we hope it is because, my Prime Minister speaking in a public address last week in Australia made the point that, we are standing up for Ukraine because we seriously believe that rules have to be respected, but also because we fully understand that what's happening in Europe has ramifications for our region. So coming back to our immediate region, and I'll use your question, Ivo, as an excuse to talk a little bit about the Pacific Islands region, because speaking of the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, we've got this spread of small island states spread across a great deal of the Pacific. And there is what they perceive to be quite a competition for their attention. I mean, they feel that they're under pressure, certainly from China, but also to some extent they feel that they're also being expected to take positions as to whether or not they would rather line up with one of the major powers or the other. So, it's quite a difficult time for smaller countries in the Pacific. We very much welcome the US presence in the Pacific. They deal in a very different way with island countries than does China. And I think it's very evident to us all that China has taken a much more aggressive style of diplomacy, been much more ready to pressure smaller countries in ways that meet their interests rather than necessarily the development interests of those Pacific partners particularly. So I think I've rambled off the point and not really answered your question, but it's... Let's put it this way, it's quite a pivotal time in our Pacific Islands region, and the more we have the company working through the Pacific Islands Forum, which is the regional organisation of the EU, of the UK, and I know that the UK is very much coming into the presence in the Pacific again, then that is very helpful. I think all we can do in these situations is to offer alternatives, and I think Karen's made some really powerful points about the way that we don't really project, advertise and explain the reasons why our value set is actually better than what the other model that's being sold quite actively. is.
Jovita, how does, from a European perspective, it's been very important to have the Indo-Pacific powers being supportive on Ukraine. Japan's role in the G7 on the sanctions regime is, and others are critical. The military support has been, in some ways, underplayed, but extraordinarily important.
South Koreans' influence in the defense capability part is as well has a huge impact on what's going on in Europe. I 100% agree that actually we cannot divide. When we speak about security, it's very difficult to divide world in kind of a. I don't want to use the spheres of influence, but sometimes I have to admit I'm surprised when there are people using we Americans, we will deal with China. You Europeans have to deal with Ukraine. I don't think that it's possible, and it actually goes the same in the same argument goes in the same direction. If we if we take one battleground, we take Ukraine as the battleground, and we are looking what is happening there. So it's not only that Russia's military presence. We see 80% of dual-use goods coming to Russia and then ending up in Ukraine. It comes either from China or through China. If we think about, 80% of Ukrainian energy infrastructure is damaged, it's done not only because of what comes from Russia, but what Russia buys actually from Iran. So then we have another battleground in the Middle East region. And then we have, missiles coming from North Korea. So I usually use the term, the coalition of ill will is there. And yes, we have to do, their explanation why, our values, our open societies, democracy, freedom, why it matters. And in general, this probably will answer why what is happening in Ukraine is so consequential. It has influence and may have quite a huge kind of a call on both sides, actually, depending what is how this situation or how the war in Ukraine actually ends. Because if Ukraine lose, I don't want to live in that kind of world if they lose, because that will be the call for all of the coalition of ill will or their silent or more vocal supporters of theirs, actually, to go out and grab, to question the borders, to question the not only the rules, to question the price of life of your neighbors. So I think that is extremely important. And once you have that in mind, so dealing with China, then kind of puts it in a different perspective. EU has a very complicated, and it is a complicated relation. I think that everyone of all the countries present here can say that. They are actually our trading partners. They are our competitors on be it technology or economy. And they are challengers. They are part of this coalition of ill will. And we have to act and react accordingly. And I think that, the concept we are living right now with de-risking strategy actually kind of alludes that, first of all, it's not only about our economic relations, but this is actually moving from pure economic interest to how we actually secure our economic interest. And we, even as EU, we don't shy to use the word protect ourselves while thinking about economic security strategy. So I think that's probably there are lots of, if you would ask, have we done all together enough or have we done separately enough? Probably not. There's quite a long way to figure out if the sectors we identified as the ones to de-risk is the right one, or how big or how kind of abroad we have to go. What should be the tools? Are the tools which we updated in the EU, the trade defense tools, are they already good enough for that? So there are a lot of homework to be done. And again, we cannot do that separately. None of our trade defense tools or economic security strategy will work if we will try to do in silos.
Karen, of course, your government, working with the U.S. and the Australian government, has tried to find a mechanism in the security field, but also in a variety of other fields, to have more active cooperation on the defense side between these three pillars of the world: the Indo-Pacific, the Atlantic, and North America. Talk a little bit about not just that strategy, particularly with regard to what's known as AUKUS, but the thinking in Britain behind how do we actually secure our future by making sure that we have strong relationships with everyone in the transatlantic and the Pacific world, the Indo-Pacific world.
So thank you. So Britain is a small island, to state the obvious, but it's had a role in world affairs for a very long time, and longer than America has. So we don't give that up.
That's true for most countries.
Yeah, exactly. And we still think of ourselves as a global, outward-looking country, and we still have a navy that's pretty big. So from a British perspective, it's not an unusual thing to think about the indivisibility of Indo-Pac security and Euro-Atlantic security. The one I would say we need to watch, which isn't the subject of today, is the Arctic. Yeah. I personally would like to see a much bigger focus on the Arctic, because the Chinese are moving in there. The Russians used to stop them, and now, because of Ukraine, the Russians are enabling them. So that's a subject for another time. I just wanted to put that on people's radar. Picking up what Jovita and Rosemary said, of course, huge amounts of world trade flows through the Indo-Pacific and the Gulf. So even if there was a disinclination to think about the indivisibility of those two areas' security, the trading aspect alone would justify being very interested and wanting to play a role there, whether that's on the economic development side of smaller nations, whether it's economic security and supply chains. And this is where the importance of alliances, I think, is really going to show itself. In all honesty, we were a bit worried a few years ago when we heard America talk about onshoring. We're too small to onshore, and even the EU would find it very hard to onshore. But friendshoring, absolutely, it's complicated, but it's a very important project that we can all participate in. So I think that's a very important part of what we're doing. I think the China question is fascinating. Back in 2010, the British government of the day had a different approach to China based on the golden era, because China herself was different. I think very sadly, what we have seen is a China moving further towards authoritarianism, including economically, and they're starting to feel the effects of that. And it is much harder now to cooperate with them. We still want to do that where we can. Areas like health, areas like climate, we absolutely want to cooperate with China, and we can still do that in some areas in a multilateral setting. But those areas, I think, have got fewer over the years, and the challenge and compete aspect of our relationships with China have really come to the fore. And it's hard, given the direction of travel of a more authoritarian China, it's hard not to see it in those terms. So to that extent, British policy, though it's economically a bit different from the United States vis-a-vis China, as a concept, it's not dissimilar. But the last thing I'll say on this is I think we would all benefit from a more conceptual approach. I don't want to imply the contest with China is another Cold War, because I don't think it is. But when I think of all the instruments we had in the Cold War, and you and I have worked on many of them, you had hotlines, you had deconfliction mechanisms, you had an understanding of each other's military doctrines, you had the beginnings of confidence-building measures and arms control. The Chinese, on the whole, do not want to take part in that. And I think that's dangerous. It gives you the risk of miscalculation. But it also means, on our side, is it containment? Is it deterrence? Is it something else we haven't thought of yet? I think that is a conversation that's long overdue.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important conversation. And Yesterday's New York Times had a long article about the changes in nuclear employment doctrine by the United States and China becoming a key factor in this, and the absence of the Chinese willingness to even talk about this with us, which is extremely dangerous. So we have work cut out for us. In our old hats can come back in new forms. I do want to pick up a different point that Karen made and you all made, and that's the technology and open society bit. And Rosemary, I think as a country, you have grappled with the issue of the internet and its impact on open societies and how to think about that when in the immediate aftermath of the horrible terrorist attacks in Christchurch in, what was it, 2020, I believe, or 2019.
2019.
And led the Christchurch call, an effort to help societies, while maintaining their openness, deal with the question of how do you deal with social media, the internet, and the negatives that flow from that. And Karen, you just had in the UK a massive example how misinformation can lead to violence. An area of huge, because we have AI, we have the technology companies, etc. But something that actually requires the cooperation of all the open societies to deal with it effectively. How does New Zealand think about that, and how is this efforts evolved?
Well, it's such a huge challenge that it's one that you'd almost say, well, where do we start? And so actually after that terrible mosque shooting in March of 2019, our government, Jacinda Ardern, former Prime Minister, who was here speaking yesterday actually at an event, decided that we would segment it down to actually just focus on violent extremism online. And so what we really targeted, because we weren't sufficiently, we just didn't consider we could take on the whole panoply of what you outlined. But what we wanted to prevent was that any future event of that kind could be live streamed, because basically that killer went into the mosque fully prepared to live stream the event as he did it. And of course, millions of people around the world within seconds saw that. And when you've seen it, you can't unsee it. I managed actually not to see it. And so the government figured out, well, you can either try to tackle this by legislation, which almost certainly won't work because the big tech companies will probably just work around it or won't really comply. Or we can do it by trying to get a voluntary arrangement which would bring together government, big tech, and civil society. And that's the way we approached it. And so we got that agreement. The Christchurch Call to Action was signed in later in that year, actually. We got it done quite quickly in Paris. And at that time, we were hopeful to get the United States on board. Not quite possible under the Trump administration, although there were many who were sympathetic to it. We subsequently had it confirmed by the Biden administration. Now, that work is still going on, although it's gone a little bit out of the public attention now. But, I think it was a good example, although limited in its scope to that sort of really nasty stuff. It was a good example of how you can actually achieve things. You can set new standards. You can get a change of behaviour if you get the different parties together and do it in a voluntary way.
So,
well,
Jovita,
yes.
I mean, there is
the
EU's is taken
different approach.
not just on this
entirely
issue,
different,
but on the
we
on the
started
larger question.
we started from the same code of conduct, and we really believe that actually those tech companies are global, and it's not enough that one or another regulate. So it would be good that everybody acts in their goodwill. But as it was I mentioned, actually, it's not really always the case that companies who are their primary interest is to seek profit, that they will actually act only based on goodwill. So a year ago, we decided to regulate this area, and the act is called Digital Service Act, which is in media often referred as a DSA. And yes, it's not liked very much. It's new of the kind, but the idea is actually to share responsibility. Instead of EU or any European government being some kind of the ministry of truth, actually to work together with their largest or the biggest platforms who are actually gatekeepers, if you wish, for all the digital services we are having access, and share responsibility with them. So what the Digital Service Act actually asks, that the companies work on their own algorithms, how they actually take the illegal content online, because things which are illegal offline, violence, abuse, child abuse, terrorism, should be illegal online as well. So let's work together. You have a certain gray period. You have to prepare. You have to make sure you have a certain algorithm. You have people responsible for that, and you work yourself way through how you take this illegal content from your platform. I'm sure it's really very difficult. It's a new thing, and we are still figuring out. We have really several investigations going on and calls for action, because not all the platforms, but I just want to assure that it's definitely not only US technological companies, but we want to protect European citizens, EU citizens, actually from really watching, the worst possible. And just to give you, I think that people sometimes forget the numbers. So one of the German institutions actually last spring did a wonderful research looking, they look specifically in a couple of social media platforms. One was X. They found that over the couple of months, you can create 20,000 of fake accounts. And because of the AI, you can generate quite individual content from those accounts. So they counted that if all the 20,000 those bots are activated, you can have 2.5 Twitter posts or X posts per second. So imagine it becomes actually impossible for one person, and even like brilliant institution as the EU is, actually to go like, you have to take this Twitter post or that Twitter post. Or even we as the users, we cannot really actually go through. So that's why we think that algorithms, and I will not go into the really very painful situations after October 7, when what happened in this attack and what was followed in the different social media platforms. Without a proper regulation, without a proper action, it's not possible. And it's really, to try to assure, especially American audience, it's not really going after, First Amendment of the Constitution. It's really only going after illegal content. Illegal. What is illegal offline should be illegal online. And I think that we have to remind ourselves that it's really very dangerous. And sometimes we want to have rules in our world here, and forget that wild west is happening out there. And I'm not even speaking about they're quite about their content which is shared with children, for example, teenagers. And there are really quite good examples of cooperation. I don't want to say that all big tech is only bad. It was really good examples with some of them of addressing for example, the content or advertising for children. So I think that's step by step. It would not would not happen over the night. But I think that is really a huge security challenge, especially with the AI, because this disinformation really becomes like a disinformation on steroids.
Karen, just what are your thoughts about it? It's a terribly complicated issue, but you brought up open societies. That's when it's so much easier to regulate, when you don't have to worry about how you maintain an open society. And yet you see the consequences. Jovita mentioned October 7th. There's March 2019. You've just had it last month with, or actually earlier this month, riots that were driven by social media and misinformation following the horrific stabbing of those 3 little girls in, where was the South? And then AI making it all worse. How do we deal with this, and how do we deal with it together? Just putting one more difficult thing in: malignant actors, state actors, using this technology for the very purposes of undermining confidence in the openness of the societies.
To state the obvious, it's an enormous subject, and it's multifaceted, and we probably have to break down each bit. So we do cooperate in the Five Eyes with the EU, with the US on the disinformation by state actors. And we have a special cyber center that does some very good work in that area. So that's one set of things we do. What New Zealand did on the call to action was groundbreaking, and we've been pleased to be a part of that. We also have, like the EU, legislation. The recent riots, though, I would put in a different category from violent extremism. Fundamentally, that was thuggery, and some of it was irresponsibility. One reason it took off was because certain far-right groups set out to exploit it and to drive racial tension as a deliberate strategy. A lot of jail sentences have been handed out. Our Prime Minister used to be our Director of Public Prosecutions, so he knows a thing or two about the power of jail sentences and how quickly you can do them. So the judges sat all through the weekend. Interestingly, the people who had not taken part in physical protest, but had, if you like, deliberately and consciously amplified the problem on social media, some of those are also being prosecuted, which I think is a new area. And it will be interesting to see what precedent in a legal sense that establishes that we might all be able to work on.
So Elon Musk shouldn't be coming to the UK anytime soon. We have had letters from Congress about this. No, he's very welcome. I think it's striking that a year ago, and I was going to come on to this bit, Elon was on stage with our then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak talking about AI in the context of a conference we held that Vice President Harris came to. So I think he holds different views at different times. I mean, don't we all? But nevertheless, he's perfectly safe if he comes to the UK. I'm talking about the person who deliberately made up a Muslim name for the person who had carried out the Southport attacks and said they were a recent immigrant, when the person was actually born in the UK and was a British citizen, and his name was nothing like the one that was made up, and then amplified and amplified and amplified. So there's something about the deliberateness of doing that with intent. It's Jovita's point about if it's illegal offline, it can be illegal online. That's incitement, and incitement is illegal. So that's one set. And then the last set of cooperations I think that we do on this is the beginnings of getting to grips with laying some guardrails for AI. We had this summit called the Bletchley Summit. The Vice President took a view particularly about the ordinary citizen. How do you provide assurance to the ordinary citizen that what they're seeing, who's phoning them, etc., is legit and is genuine? And then, of course, you have the state-to-state, company-to-company side.
And we do want to work with industry so that a lot of this is self-regulation by industry, but it's good, high-quality self-regulation. The Koreans held a follow-up summit, and I think I'm right in saying the French will hold the next one. So that's a piece of international cooperation that is iterative, I think, necessarily, but hopefully over the years, we will start to put some shape on what is acceptable, what is not acceptable.
And it's particularly important just to emphasize what I think all three are you're saying is that you would like to have as much global participation and cooperation in these areas. But it is
we did invite the Chinese to go back to our earlier discussion because they are a key part of any discussion on AI.
Yeah. But it's particularly important that at least the open societies are able to start this process because they're more vulnerable in some ways to that reality. There are people lining up to ask questions, which is unfortunate because I still have 15 questions I wanted to ask. But let me open it up to the floor and to people online. I will check this, but we'll start with the first question from Alan Rich.
I want to go back to something Rosemary said at the very beginning, when you were talking about the conflict between a rules-based world order and a power-based world order. And then listening to the conversation, what I really heard was a conversation that engaged Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. But, there were a great many countries that were not included and don't feel included. And I was thinking to myself, if the ambassadors of India, South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil were sitting here, they say, where are we in this mix? And we saw that manifest itself in terms of the reactions to the invasion of Ukraine. Because we would have hoped that more, a bigger part of the world would have spoken out about the invasion of Ukraine than actually did. There were some, positive votes in the United Nations, but we didn't see a number of major players in the world that we would say are open or semi-open societies really engaged to the extent that we would. So when we evaluate a world, a rules-based society, a world order, what changes do we need to begin to contemplate so that we're sure to incorporate a broader group of nations today?
Rosemary, let's start with you because you're from the South.
Right. Well, I just was at another event this morning where Senator Chris Coons was speaking a little bit about what a foreign policy agenda might look like for a Harris administration. And he made the point that more space has to be made for the global South in the inherited rules-based institutional order. And I think that's true, but it's easier said than done. As Karen and I both know, having lived through a period in the UN where there were genuine attempts, to reform and enlarge the Security Council and bring in newer players. However, I think a number of those countries that you just mentioned in the question did actually line up or are actually being very active, as for South Africa, in opposing Russia in its aggression against Ukraine. But, you could paraphrase the Michelle Obama thing about when they go low, we go high, and say, when times get tough, our team gets tighter. So I think it is incumbent on countries who are like-minded, like all of us on the stage at the moment, but many others as well, as you point out, to thicken up our dialogue about, what sort of world do we actually want and what kind of changes, therefore, do we have to agree to make. We do need some kind of rules structure. Societies don't operate comfortably without some kind of architecture.
Jovita, you wanted to jump in?
I think we should not be too actually defensive on that. I think that a lot of countries actually are taking our world order for granted, and they do believe that they can have some other world order. But this another world order may actually be ruled by totally different rules, and the colleagues actually mentioned that. And it could be not the rules; it will be power. It will be power of a bigger country over the smaller ones. It will be, economic coercion, closing the borders if you wish, or just cyber attack, because you don't need to have an army to organize, and to actually discredit all your critical infrastructure. You need one computer, only one. Okay, maybe a bit bigger server, but that's for the sake of argument. But we are diplomats. I can argue both sides. So by even saying that,
I'm a lawyer, so I can.
okay, good. So we are like-minded. So on one hand, we should actually explicitly say what is those rules based, and is based actually to secure actually the one who is not in the strongest position. It was always the how it worked. This is one thing, and another thing is that on the other hand, let's admit that among the like-minded, we had quite a limited discussion. What is our offer on the table for the countries to get interested and to be involved, be it the conflict, war in Ukraine, but there could be other things. Well, we want to see how to deal with the AI, or how we deal with the illegal content. How kind of make sure that they are interested in what we have. And only in the last year, we started to talk that, okay, countries in G7 and plus EU, maybe we should actually think what should be this offer. And we come up that we want to have $600 billion for the investments all around Global South, if you wish, although I don't really very much like the name. And where should we actually start? How we should not help, but what is the need for them and for us to make this world a better place? And I'm really hoping that the projects like Lobito Corridor, ensuring the transport infrastructure or connectivity, can be one of the good examples how we can go around. We talk a lot about critical minerals. But we have to think and work with those, for example, South American countries, to make sure that there are enough investments in there that they can actually not only mine them, but produce there, and then we would be less dependent, and we kind of as well get our interest in or our supply chain in order. Diversifying those supply chains. So, it's a pity. Well, we are like-minded, but not 100% aligned. In our offer, trade agreements are on the table. So we will be looking for the next administration having as well trade agreements on the table, because trade actually works. It creates not only revenues in tax. It creates jobs. It opens opportunities for businesses everywhere. And it actually creates a middle class, if you wish, to push the governments to be more democratic and more open in here. So, keeping our fingers crossed.
I think your question comes in two parts, and I don't think they're the same. The four countries you mentioned have a particular view of world affairs. They start from the point of view of self-interest. Nothing wrong with that. But they care more about self-interest than cooperation. Look at what happens in international trade deals with one of those countries in particular. Right at the start of the Ukraine crisis, those countries were always a little bit sitting on the fence. There is an interesting question to them as to why they don't want to uphold the UN Charter, which very clearly makes obvious that Russia's invasion is illegal. So that's a question that they have to answer, not us. But there are other countries who now, and one can understand this completely, worry about the double standards vis-a-vis Gaza. And that's a debate we have to have. But I think those two things are actually different, because those four countries, as I say, have a particular view of world affairs. What we need to do about it is we do, in my view, in Britain's view, need to change the governance. We do need to expand the Security Council. But what holds that up isn't the nasty evil European powers or the nasty evil North America. What holds it up are those countries' neighbours, the fact that the African Union can't agree who would get the African seats, and China, who does not want to see the Security Council expanded but won't say so. So there's a very particular problem in the UN that should be overcome. I think over the next year or so, you will see different governance in the IMF and the World Bank and the multilateral development banks that will do much more to take account of the broader interests of countries who, when those institutions were formed, were not really players on the world stage. And we're all for that.
Set of very important issues. Given that we're running a little bit out of time, we're just going to, we'll have a next question. And I'm not going to ask everyone necessarily to answer every question.
My name's Kenneth Newman. And while the Gaza war and the Ukraine-Russia war certainly gets its media coverage in the U.S., there's less coverage of the West-Southwest Pacific. And to our Kiwi friend here, is New Zealand increasing its Navy? Because I know the U.S. Navy needs to grow by a couple more carriers. And so I wanted to know, even though you're a couple thousand miles away from that area, are you guys building more ships?
Wow, this is a difficult one for us. We have to replace our existing frigates, actually, but just in recent times, on the positive side, we have just purchased in the last couple of years 4 of the new P-8 Orion maritime surveillance aircraft and 5 new C-130J Hercules. Now, these numbers seem pathetically small in a US context, obviously, but remember, there's only 5.1 million of us, like we're the size of, I'm not sure, I always forget which of the American states we're the size of, but what we are very committed to doing is to working as smartly and cleverly and interoperably as we can with our ally Australia and with our closest partners, US, UK, and others in our region. And so, we are very much at the moment reviewing our defence capability, and we'll have what we call a defence capability plan come out in October or November of this year. And it will start to address some of your questions about what capability we need in future. But short answer, since we're running out of time.
No, that's great. Thank you. Next question.
Good afternoon. I'm Lydia Stasen. I'm an emerging leader with the Council and the Executive Director of the Institute of Global Homelessness. I'm under strict instructions from my board chair, Baroness Louise Casey, to send warm greetings to you, Dame Pierce. And my question is, do you think there's lessons from the EU for governance, for collaboration, bringing 27 very different countries, cultures, languages together that might be instructive to the rest of us?
Well, yes. Yes and no. We have good lessons and bad lessons. And about bad lessons, I will give Karen the floor.
Karen, aren't you happy that we're only having one answer to this question? Sorry.
Yeah,
On the contrary.
Okay, you can have it.
Talk for quite a long time.
Yeah.
No, you can.
And for the good lessons is the more countries there are, the more difficult sometimes decisions are to take. But actually, the biggest, I think, investment and into their decision making happens not only during decision making, but on the process when the member states enters the EU or the reform process, and aligning with all their treaties or regulations we have. I think this is one thing, but we can go into the details one by one.
Karen, you want to say a word? No. Next question.
Thanks for coming, and thank you, Ivo, for bringing up both Christchurch and the riots, the terrible riots that were in England. The other thread that ties those two things together, of course, is Islamophobia, and I think there's been a rise in Islamophobia, whether it be in Europe, the UK, New Zealand, or here at home, with the terrible killing of a boy here out in Plainfield, Illinois. outside of the context of social media, is there anything else that your government should do to combat Islamophobia? And has domestic Islamophobia had any impact on foreign relations with Muslim majority countries, whether they be Malaysia and Indonesia or Tunisia and Morocco, for example?
Karen.
I think very sadly there's been a rise in a lot of extremism, and minority communities are victims of that. And with Islamophobia, of course, you have to worry about anti-Semitism, which too often they are two sides of the same coin, which is awful, but nevertheless a fact. And both are on the rise. I think it's factually true as a result of 7 October. It's not just about social media, as you say. In the UK, we put a lot of money into organisations, including NGOs, but also local government organisations that help community relations, whether that's a Jewish community or a Muslim community or a West African community. And that's been quite successful. And Louise Casey, who someone mentioned earlier, did a fantastic report on racism in Britain and what could be done about it and recommendations. And a lot of those have been followed both at the national level, the local government level, and civil society level. We try and bring religious leaders into a lot of discussion of community relations. There's some quite good research, I think, that shows that what happens at the grassroots is really, really important. There's a bit of a tendency on the part of government to think it's all about structures and it's all about policies. But I think I'm right in saying there's some very good research about how doing things at the grassroots is what probably makes the biggest difference over time. So I would highlight those things. And the police also in the UK a while ago embarked on a very serious campaign to be trusted in Muslim majority communities. And to be honest, that has largely paid off. A lot of the information that the authorities get about possible extremist attacks come from Muslim communities being good citizens. And that's well known. And I do think in the case of the recent riots, one of the best things to see was ordinary citizens coming out, confronting the far right, and having a citizens' protest against the protesters. And in one borough of London called Walthamstow, this was amazing. Practically the whole borough came out on the streets. And, you know, they had massive numbers, and it showed up how few people really were supporting the far right. And then that started to gain momentum right the way across the UK. There's also a campaign called Walk With Me, which is a social media campaign so that people, often from Muslim communities, but not only, who don't feel safe riding on the local subway, someone will go with them, meet them and go with them and try and show a bit of friendliness. So grassroots and systematic.
No, I think a lot of countries can learn a lot from the United Kingdom in trying to address these issues, which are longstanding and extremely difficult. We're almost out of time, but I have one question that came in online, which I think is particularly appropriate, because the reason you're here is because of the election in the United States. I'm not going to ask an election question. The question is this: the United States is about to nominate a woman for the second time to head a major party ticket. Each of you have had woman leaders as heads of government in Lithuania or in terms of the EU as well. Do you think it's time that in 2026 there be a woman elected to be the next Secretary General of the United Nations? And the question rightly says, what are your governments going to do to make that possible?
Well, can I start? We already tried. So our former Prime Minister, Helen Clark, and I was her chef de cabinet, in effect, on that campaign. So we had one try. So now it's somebody else's turn.
I mean, yes, obviously. You can't keep 50% of the world's population down, nor should you even try, not just for moral reasons, but for economic reasons. How on earth can any country or any organization truly hope to prosper if 50% of its members are not properly, fully, equally represented? But I think I'm right in saying the UN has now changed the way it elects the Secretary General. It used to be that a regional group, and it was usually taken in turns, would put forward a candidate. So you could have said regional group X should be putting forward a woman candidate. Now it's much more open, and people can nominate themselves, and they go through hustings and interviews. So it probably isn't right to interfere too much in that process. So you've got to balance those two things: the desirability of having a woman as the world's leader versus the participation of United Nations members in the selection of the Secretary General.
It's always important who sits on the selection panel, I would say, from like just a senior management position, you know. But I think I'm in a quite comfortable position because almost 1/3 of our member states actually claim they have a feminist foreign policy. So I'm sure they will help to implement that.
The question is which woman leader is the EU going to support? But we will have to wait until 2026. It's been a fantastic conversation. Really want to thank all three of you to be part of it. It was rich and sometimes hopeful, not always depressing, which is what usually we have when we talk about the world. And hopefully in 2026, we can come back here and have a discussion about how your three governments did this, having a woman leader as the UN Secretary General. So thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel today. Thank you.